Hello, everyone. I'm Valerie Paley, Chief Historian at New York Historical Society and Director of its Center for Women's History, which is the first such center within the walls of a major museum in the United States. I'm pleased to welcome you all to a virtual adaptation of the center's robust Salon series of public programs, which brings together leaders, thinkers, writers, and practitioners of women's history. These people embrace an understanding of history writ large, which heeds and celebrates women's critical contributions to the nation's past. Before I begin tonight's discussion, I want to say thank you to all of our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other donors for your generosity. I would like to also acknowledge Joyce B. Cowan, as well as Diane Max and her late husband, Adam E. Max, champions of women's history and of our center. Your support allows New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission to make history matter. And now to our program. Our conversation will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. The chat function has been disabled, so please do be sure to use Q&A. After the presentation, our moderator will get to as many questions as time allows. This evening, we are thrilled to be joined by the author of Sisters and Rebels, Jacquelyn Dowd Hall, who is Julia Cherry Spruill Professor Emeritus at UNC Chapel Hill and founding director of the university's Southern Oral History Program. She is past president of the Organization of American Historians and the Southern Historical Association, and founding president of the Labor and Working Class History Association. Sisters and Rebels, A Struggle for the Soul of America, her most recent book, won the 2020 PEN America Jacqueline Bograd Weld Award for biography, the 2020 Summersell Prize for the best book on the history of the American South, a 2020 Prose Award from the Association of American Publishers for outstanding work by a trade press, and the Bell Award from the Georgia Historical Society for the best book in Georgia history. It also was co-winner of the Charles S. Sydnor Award from the Southern Historical Association for the best book in Southern history, and a finalist for the Plutarch Award from Biographers International. Is that all, Jacqueline? That's a lot of awards. It is phenomenal. Our moderator, Carol Berkin, is Presidential Professor of History Emerita at Baruch College and the Graduate Center at City University of New York. She's the author of several books, including First Generations, Women in Colonial America, A Brilliant Solution, Inventing the American Constitution, Revolutionary Mothers, Women in the Struggle for America's Independence, and most recently, A Sovereign People, The Crises of the 1790s and the Birth of American Nationalism. She's a frequent contributor to PBS and History Channel History Channel television documentaries on early American and Revolutionary era history, and edits the Gilder Lehrman online journal, History Now. No stranger to New York Historical, where she is a regular participant in our public programs and serves on the Center for Women's History Scholarly Board. Carol also serves on the scholarly boards of several professional organizations, including the National Museum of Women's History. I will now turn things over to Jackie and Carol.
Thank you, Valerie. Well, this is a real treat for, I think, both of us. Jackie and I, once upon a time, along with Ken Jackson, were the only Southerners in the history program at Columbia University, and were distinguished by the fact that we were certainly the only people who began conversations with, "Hi, y'all." Today, I'm going to start with some questions about her new book, which I really encourage you all to purchase. Jackie is not only a brilliant historian, but she's a historian who writes beautifully, not always two things that go together. So Jackie, can you give us a brief introduction to the Lumpkin Sisters, who are the subject of this collective biography?
Sure. These three sisters were born into a former slave-owning family in Georgia at the end of the 19th century, and steeped in devotion to white supremacy and the lost cause. Elizabeth, the eldest, became a quite famous orator on the Confederate Veterans Reunion Circuit at a time when oratory was monopolized by men. Grace, who was next in line, decamped to New York in the 1920s and became a radical novelist focused on the working women of the South. By the 1930s, she was, as she put it, a warm fellow traveler of the Communist Party. She was also married to her live-in lover, a militant fur and leather worker with literary aspirations. As the radical movements of the 30s and 40s gave way to McCarthyism in the Cold War, she reversed course entirely. She spent the last decades of her life denouncing her former allies and renouncing her own best work. Catherine Dupree Lumpkin, the youngest, is the moral center of the book. She too made it to New York in the 1920s. She studied at Columbia, then returned home to lead an anti-racist interracial student movement in the Jim Crow South. She, for many decades, shared her life with a radical economist named Dorothy Wolfe Douglas at Smith College. She was the former wife of the prominent Senator Paul Douglas. At a time when women who aspired to intellectual lives faced soul-crushing obstacles, they built alternative institutions and intellectual careers. They devoted themselves in the 30s and 40s to the left wing of the New Deal. Catherine is best known for her classic autobiography, The Making of a Southerner, which was inspired by the civil rights ferment that followed World War II. In it, she traced her indoctrination into the culture of white supremacy and how she unlearned everything she had been taught to believe. Her goal was to remake the South, to change the South by convincing other white Southerners that they could do what she had done. So as you can see, these three sisters were very different from one another, but they were tied together by the fact that each spent her life grappling with a shared legacy, a legacy of patriarchy and systemic racism, in which, as white women, they were implicated in complicated ways. So in this book, I weave their lives together and thread their stories through almost a century's worth of historic events, movements, and intellectual debates. That strategy of combining group biography with big picture history allowed me to bring to visibility sites of creativity and experimentation that don't usually make their way into history books, and to recover a history of interracial coalition building and progressive struggle that was organic to the South, that included whites and Blacks, expatriates, as well as people who never left the region. And it also allowed me to join in an ongoing conversation about how white Americans can face up to and grapple with our country's original sin.
You mentioned the lost cause and the experience that marked their life, that is, how to overcome or escape or erase that experience. Can you tell us a little bit? Well, you don't have to tell me, I grew up in Alabama, but can you, can you tell the audience a little bit about this regional mythology that we know as the lost cause? And can you briefly describe it? It's a version, not just, I think, of Southern history, but of American history. And tell us what experiences these women had. I mean, you've suggested them mostly escaping the South, for some period of their lives. But tell us what experiences allowed them to reshape their identities in such dramatic fashion.
Well, the Lost Cause was a battle for historical memory, an effort on the part of conservative white Southerners to assert their understanding of slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction. And to achieve national reconciliation on their own terms. This version of the past was always contested by Blacks, but as you say, it was accepted by white Americans throughout the country. In this distorted narrative, slavery was a beneficent institution, a school of civilization, which eventually would have ended of its own accord. The Civil War, the South seceded, not in order to protect slavery, but in order to defend the constitutional principle of states' rights. Reconstruction was a tragic mistake in which Northern fanatics tried to elevate Blacks over whites. It's important to remember that this battle for public memory did not peak in the decades right after the war, when white Southerners, bereaved white Southerners, built monuments to honor the dead. Rather, it peaked decades later in the early 20th century, in the wake of the interracial populist infusion campaigns, which were movements on the part of Black and white farmers who united against white elites. These interracial movements were met and destroyed by a violent campaign to reestablish white unity and supremacy by disfranchising and segregating Blacks. And it was in that period, that later period, that the Confederate monuments that are toppling as we speak were built. And they were built not just to honor the memory of fallen soldiers, but to honor soldiers turned Klansmen and to celebrate the success of their white supremacy campaigns. Mm-hmm. So the Lumpkin Sisters Lumpkin Sisters' father fought in the Civil War and then participated in acts of terrorism as a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And he deployed his daughters as foot soldiers in the Lost Cause movement. He taught them that their mission was to keep the ideals that the Confederate monument stood for alive. And they, unlike many people today, had no doubt that white supremacy lay at the heart of those ideals. The South might have lost the Confederacy might have lost the Civil War, but as long as whites ruled over Blacks, its principles were vindicated. Its cause had not been lost. For Catherine, the process of freeing herself from those myths and redefining her life's mission started young, in a series of turning points that made her doubt the righteousness and infallibility of her father and of the worldview of the people around that she was of her community. And the most traumatic of these was an incident in which she saw her supposedly gallant, gentlemanly father viciously beating a Black woman, the family's cook. Also important was a period when he moved his family to a hardscrabble farm in a delusional bid to recapture his plantation past. And it was there that Catherine, for the first time, came in close contact with poverty, with the Black and white poor. Her doubts about the worldview she had inherited deepened when she went to a small white women's college in North Georgia. And there she encountered the far-sighted women of the YWCA. They introduced her to the social gospel and to the interracial student movement that she would later lead. She was also immersed in a dynamic student culture that revolved around romantic friendships between women. Those friendships, along with the social gospel, set her life on a new course. Her experience was not unique, and I argue that these segregated white women's colleges, along with the coeducational colleges that most Black women went to, and the interracial YWCA, played a bigger role in the civil rights movement and in Southern women's history than most of the literature would lead us to believe. And equally critical for Catherine, were the early 1920s, which she spent as head of the YWCA student division in the South. Tasked with building an interracial movement in a segregated region, she and the young Black women she worked with struggled to build relationships in which they would lead this organization on a basis of equality. And they did so without models or guides in a period when in the North, as well as in the South, it was almost impossible even to find places to meet together. Grace Lumpkin had eye-opening experiences in the years around World War I as well. And like so many of their generation, both Grace and Catherine turned further to the left during the Great Depression, which they saw as many people see our own moment of crisis. Like our own pandemic, the stock market crash revealed the cruelty and rapaciousness of unfettered capitalism and the precarity and inequality of American life. But it also opened up possibilities for radical change by galvanizing the labor movement and melting traditional obstacles to government action.
You know, I'm very struck by the role of education and creating a situation in which women can come together. And as those of us who write about the post-American Revolutionary period, the rise of young ladies' academies, where you could discover that whatever dissatisfaction or unease about the norms, the way things are, was not an idiosyncratic problem, but was in fact a systemic, a social, cultural problem. And I hope also that maybe the audience doesn't realize that Catherine Lumpkin wrote a book about Angelina Grimke, a very famous slave owner's daughter who had similar experiences of seeing this kind of cruelty around her toward African Americans, who moved to Philadelphia and rather than joining a college, became part of a Quaker meeting house that gave her a similar position from which she could view and analyze her past. And so in a sense, Lumpkin is writing her own story in writing the story about Angelina Grimke, one of my heroines, you know, and someone I wrote about in my book. But I want to get to my favorite question to ask you, which is, how did the experiences of these three sisters resonate with your own experiences as a Southern woman committed to racial and gender equality? I mean, you have been an activist both in academe and outside of academe in fighting for racial justice. How do you relate to these, to especially Catherine, on and her experiences on a personal level?
Well, I've always known that this story of race radicalism and reaction that I was spoke to my own life and times. That's what drew me to it in the first place. But I could not have imagined how resonant that history would turn out to be now in our present moment. I first read Catherine's autobiography in the early 70s. I was living in Atlanta and working for a civil rights organization and immersed in the student feminist anti-war counterculture of the city. And I also at that time had a foot in New York, where I was trying to write a Columbia dissertation in the then brand new field of women's history. The Deep South plantation background that Catherine wrote about couldn't have been more different from my upbringing in Oklahoma, where the West meets the South and where my grandfather was a sharecropper turned barber who had to drop out of school and never learned to read. But I was very much taken with her book. Her portrait of the South as a land scarred by slavery, but rich in a history of progressive struggle, resonated with how I saw the region. And I felt a kinship between my own generation of dissident Southerners and her generation, her Depression era generation of activists, intellectuals. And I also felt some reverberations between her college experience and my own in a small church-related college in Tennessee, where I also was influenced by liberal Christianity, and where I joined hands with Black students we were in segregated colleges, but came together to stand up to the culture of segregation that had surrounded me all of my life. Likewise, in certain ways, her experience as one of the few white Southerners at Columbia in the 1920s reminded me of my own experience in the 1960s. I was in the final stages of writing Sisters and Rebels when one of the country's most right-wing Republican regimes took over all three branches of North Carolina's government. My husband and fellow historian Bob Korstad and I were among the first groups of arrestees in the civil disobedience demonstrations led by the Reverend William Barber. And we participated in the Moral Mondays movement, which was an inspiring interracial coalition that helped to blunt that right-wing takeover. At the same time, or as the Moral Monday movement was developing, the Confederate monuments, which had long been controversial, but came under truly an astoundingly effective, sustained critique. Multiracial protests hammered home the message that Black Lives Matter, and white as well as Black Americans began to think about racism as Catherine Dupree Lumpkin had thought about it in her own time, as, in her own words, quote, a social, economic, psychological complex that can only be dismantled by deep going moral and structural change. So as I watched this new battle over race and memory play out in my own university, in my own adopted state, I felt more than ever the relevance and resonance of the story that I was trying to tell.
It's it's always odd, I think, when your identification with your subject matter makes you think as well every day that you sit down at the computer or begin to do research. It makes you think as well about your own life. I mean, that I have found on occasions that is a kind of difficult, keeping the two separate for me was more difficult than seeing how they merged. So how do the lives of dissenting women like the Lumpkins help us to see the South and the country in a different and more complex way? And how does the history of their lives speak to our battle today? You couldn't have published this book in a more appropriate moment with the rise of both Black Lives Matter and the current politics of this country. So what can we learn from their experiences and how they struggled with reshaping their identity that would help us today?
Well, the first thing I would say is that white women who are trying to come to grips with issues of complicity and privilege should know that they are by no means the first to do so. We can, as Virginia Woolf famously put it, think back through our mothers. That is, we can learn from women's history. We can learn, we can see how often women like Elizabeth Lumpkin shored up white supremacy, even as she expanded her own horizons. But we can also learn from her younger sisters about how both gender and racial consciousness can change. Second, the sisters' stories challenge the tendency to see the South only as a reservoir of reaction and backwardness. Grace mounted that challenge most powerfully in her best-known novel, To Make My Bread, in which she put forward a view of the Southern mountains that countered the hillbilly stereotypes that persist to this day. And Catherine's autobiography challenged that typecasting of the South in even more complicated ways. The third point I would make is that focusing on these dissenting women lifts up, well, let me back up just a little bit and say just a little bit more about Catherine's autobiography. Central to her transformation was learning a different history of the South. And at the same time, and a history especially learning about the moments of interracial coalition in the South's history, while at the same time doing the hard work of coalition building herself. Her father equated Southern identity with white unity and white supremacy. What Catherine learned was that she could identify with a different, dissident, multiracial, insurgent South. She did not have to reject her identity as a white Southerner, a native daughter, in order to devote herself to trying to change the region and the nation. So the third point then, I would say, is that focusing on these dissenting women allows us to lift up a left feminist strand of the women's movement, and thus to question the tendency to view the women's movement as a single issue campaign dominated by the white middle class. So, and that left feminist strand, I think, informs the most vital parts of the women's movement today. And in that sense, it's part of what the great civil rights leader Ella Baker called a continuity of struggle, a struggle in which radical women, Black and white, both in the 20s, 30s, and 40s in our own time, have linked women's emancipation to racial and economic justice and infused feminist consciousness into movements that don't explicitly prioritize gender equality, especially the labor and civil rights movement and the struggle for a strong safety net. During the Great Depression, left feminists did something similar to what the left wing of the Democratic Party is trying to do today. In a time of crisis, they fought to push government policies in an inclusive social democratic direction, in part by shifting the cost of the safety net to the wealthiest Americans, and in part by extending the safety net's protections to Blacks of both races and to white women, groups that were originally excluded from the New Deal's landmark legislation.
Jackie, we are going to have to go to questions, which are piling up for,
okay.
for
right.
the audience. But I love this book in large part, not in large, but in one major part, and that is it draws for us very clearly the connection we can have today with women of the past, instead of simply seeing them as curiosities or as interesting figures. We can actually incorporate what we know about their lives into the struggles for our own identity, and nothing, I think, could be more important to feminists today. So we have some questions for you. Some of them, in a sense, you've already answered, but one question was, these sisters clearly have divergent moral foundations. As a biographer, I love this because I write biographies too, I always get asked this question. Does your thinking or process change whether or not you like your subject? Right?
Oh, yeah. So when I first started working on this book, my plan was to focus on Catherine with Grace Lumpkin as a sort of foil, kind of as Elizabeth to some extent is in the book. But and the reason for that was, I came to realize, was that I liked Catherine better than I liked Grace. I clearly shared her politics, I respected her, and so on. But I came to feel that if I could, in a sense, this sounds a little strange, rescue Grace from herself, that is, to go back and, through my own research, capture the kind of courageous, vital work that she did in her younger days, I could and contrast that with the kind of isolated and bitter person she became in the end, and hold both the scholars and writers that Catherine, the network of scholars and writers that Catherine moved in, and the network of radical fiction writers and that Grace moved in, that I could put those in conversation with each other and tell a richer story than a biography as opposed to a group biography could have told.
I have disliked the personality of people I have written about, who I began to write about because, in fact, I so admired, and she was a heroine in my life, and then I discovered she was really such an unpleasant human being that it became very hard to finish that article that I wrote, because and people kept saying to me, "Oh, are you going to write a full-scale book about her?" I said, "Absolutely not. I don't think I could stand it." So now we have a very interesting question for you. This extraordinary narrative is certainly a work of women's history. The awards it has won, however, honor it as a work of history in a broader and more expansive sense. As an early practitioner in the field of women's history, is this a heartening validation of the way the field has evolved, or is it, I mean, the implicit other piece of this, or is it a demeaning of the field that you're involved in?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Do we want to be fully integrated in, or do we want to remain separate?
Well, let me put it this way. Valerie asked me if that was all the awards I'd won, but I actually have won one more. The Southern Association of Women Historians, I just heard a couple of days ago, has given this book the Spruill Award for the best work in Southern women's history. And I must say, I was really, really thrilled by that.
Yes, yes.
So that made a difference to me.
But do you think that these awards reflect final acceptance? I mean, you and I were part of that generation where people said, I remember when I went from writing about loyalists to wanting to write about women, people said, "Oh, but you had such a good career beginning. Why would you want to do that? What is the point of this?" So do you feel that when you begin to get these awards from places that are not identified as women's history venues, that it reflects an acceptance of the importance of what we do in a way that's gratifying to you?
Yes.
Yeah,
I do.
I would think so. Now, in 2020, would you say that in a racial sense, the South is still behind the metropolis on the Hudson River?
I don't know what that would mean exactly.
It's very
ahead of and behind.
It's very funny. People say, "Oh, the South, it's so backward." And I've traveled all across this country, especially when we had teaching American history grants. I've been to every state in the Union except North Dakota, and I really feel I can lead a satisfying life without going there. But one of the things I found is the South is everywhere.
Exactly.
That cliched South is everywhere. There's an old joke that between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, it's Alabama. And what people don't understand is in Alabama, a lot of places like Birmingham are as forward-looking in many ways as Pittsburgh and Philadelphia are. So I think that that's a question that often comes up. Is there something called, and your book makes the argument that there is not something called the South, that there is an enormous amount of variation in politics, in goals, in aspirations, and in experiences that really are often more complicated and more various than in areas of this country that are exclusively white. I mean, in a sense, the racial differences in the South, I think, have always forced thinking and well-meaning and progressive Southerners to grapple with issues in a much more complicated way than people who don't know any Black people and don't live near any Black people and have never had any kind of relationship, positive or negative, with a Black person. So I would say that you and I have been pretty lucky to have had the kinds of experiences that we have had.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't say it better.
Well, I've had a lot of experience with it living in New York, I have to tell you. Let me see. Oh, here's a question from your mentor and our fellow Southerner, Ken Jackson.
Oh.
When the middle sister moved to New York City in the 1920s, Gotham was very different from the South. And when Professor Hall and Berkin came to New York in the 1960s, the big city was still very different from the South. Yes, Manhattan was very different. I mean, I came up as a Jew from Alabama. And I remember my mother asking me, and I went to Barnard and Columbia, you know, where every second person was Jewish. And my mother said to me, have you met any Jewish people? And I said, Mom, it's crawling with them, you know, it's amazing. So, but I don't think now Ken, you can correct me, but I don't think that if you were in the Bronx or in parts of Queens, it would be all that different from the world that I grew up in. What do you think, Jackie? You know,
I can't speak to that. I will say that I had gone to Rhodes College in Memphis, which has been in the news recently.
Yes, you're a Rhodes Scholar.
Exactly. Where our Trump's Supreme Court nominee went to college, to the great dismay of me and my classmates. Rhodes is a kind of wonderful school in its own way. It's was at that time a Presbyterian school, and it's a beautiful school, but it's tiny. And for me, when I first got there, it was just fabulous. It was so liberating and so wonderful. But by the time I left, I was just suffocating. Mm-hmm. And I remember so vividly, I took the bus to New York to come to graduate school. I'd never been to New York. And I got off the subway in the wrong part of this, some other borough, and I finally found my way to Columbia. And I remember walking along the sidewalk with my suitcase and looking at all the bars on the windows and I'd never seen that before, in these big granite buildings. And I was totally, nobody knew me. I knew nobody. I was totally anonymous. I was totally shy, but I was just as happy as a lark. I had a great time at Columbia in the 60s.
Well, I always say there's a children's book I read to both my children called Where's Waldo? And the last in the series is Waldo, who is a misfit, finds Waldo Land. And that is how I think about New York, that I found my Waldo Land. This is where I belong. But you have returned to the South. I mean,
yeah, no, I didn't feel that I belonged there at all. That's what I liked about it, was being somewhere that I didn't belong. I felt, I very self-consciously moved back to the South in 1970 because, or the way I thought about it at the time, in any case, was that I felt that the civil rights movement was I didn't know what the future of it was going to be. The women's movement was developing. And it was just really clear to me that I could be much more effective, much more literate in the South than I could in New York. I was a outsider and a spectator.
Well, I'm very glad you went back and are still fighting the good fight. Thank you so much for sharing all of this wonderful conversation with me. I really enjoyed it.
This was phenomenal, and I think we could have gone on and on and on and on. And though, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you so much, Jackie and Carol, and to our audience for your exceptional support of the New York Historical Society. See you next time.
Thank you.